so keeping with the kind of themes that were brought up about the relationship and our relationship to Cuba, what's important for us to know about Cuba as it relates to Assata Shakur and then international coalition movement?
I would like to answer this question. Peace, everybody. I'm Delaney.
Hi, Delaney.
I was recently in Cuba a couple weeks ago on the ground delivering medicine to African doctors. But you know, when I was there, and my comrade right here, Skipper, brother Skipper, and I, we went together and we distributed the aid. That's a very important elder right there. But either way, I bring that up all to say is that I recently have had contact with Africans on the island, and this was my second time being on the island, and I just want to, as I say all of this, as I say what I'm about to say, I want you guys to remember this context that I'm about to share of what is happening on the island in terms of the blockade. So we hear the blockade, we hear about these sanctions, and we're like, wow, that's horrible. You know, they can't get medicine, they can't get food, they can't trade. But what does that actually look like on the ground, right? It's different to hear about it, right? And on the ground, I can tell you is that folks are struggling. Folks are absolutely struggling. Folks are living literally meal by meal, literally drink by drink, day by day. Folks are really, really struggling. And much of this is due to, the blockade, of course, the sanctions. Some of it is due to other things that I'm not going to get into too deeply right now, but when I say that people don't have Advil, like, I mean that, right? Like, we were distributing Advil to folks. We were distributing things like laxatives to folks for, people's fathers who have colon cancer, right? And they can't even get the chemotherapy doesn't even have a chance to work because they're so backed up. And for us, it's like, oh, hit CVS, go get that laxative, take that laxative, you're good. You can't do that on the island because these people are actively facing what I define as a genocidal blockade where they're being restricted medical access. And when we think about, and like I said, think about that context and think about how Cuba continues to open its borders to international schools at ELAM, which is the international school for medicine in Latin America. They open up their arms. I've been there. I've spoken to African students here from the States that are studying there. I spoke to a black woman, and I asked her, like, what does this mean for you? Like, you're here, you know the tension that is being experienced between the United States and Cuba. What was your reason for wanting to study here? And what she told me is, not only is just the way that they educate folks in terms of what you're actually learning. Prevention is a really big deal for medicine in Cuba. Very, very different to how our medical system operates here. But one of the things that she said is thinking about, and this is something that she told me impacted her after she got there, right? This is something that kind of has solidified her reasoning for being there. I'll be more specific. She said that learning about the history of how Cuba has continued to send its doctors out while folks can't even get access to bare necessities, and the Cuban government is still choosing to extend itself to the African continent, particularly as mentioned in places like Burkina Faso, in places like Angola, in places like South Africa, in places like the Congo. In the Caribbean, there are some places, such as those in Jamaica and otherwise, where the only doctors that are around are Cuban doctors, right? Remember what I told you about folks not having anything? Remember what I told you about folks struggling? And what I'll say to that is, being on the island, there's a certain level of dedication to personhood, of just, I see you for who you are. We are not operating on the basis of extraction. And I think that's something that socially in Cuba plays a huge, huge, huge role in their ability to offer themselves to the world. And I say all that to say in the context of Assata because we know that the blockade is a big deal, right? We know the blockade is causing these problems. We understand that Assata was being held there. And we know that there were many times where Cuba had the opportunity to have the blockade lifted by giving up Assata. And it was still no. It was still no. We're not giving her up. And I think that it speaks to, the reason why I say that is because that speaks to, it wasn't just Cuba saw this as the politically correct thing to do, right? To keep this sister, to protect this sister, right? But Cuba has always, since the revolution, been very clear about the importance of Africans in the development of the country and in the spirit of the country. Cuba is an African country. And I cannot stress this enough. We were talking about racism earlier. Absolutely still exists, right? We think about white Miami Cubans that are in Florida, right? Absolutely do exist. But on the continent, we are talking about millions of African people in the east of the island, in Guantanamo, in Santiago, in Matanzas, and other places, right by Haiti, right by Jamaica. Millions and millions of African people that have been able to retain their cultural significance, their religious traditions, such as Ifa, in the Yoruba tradition. They've been able to retain the communalist aspects of the tribe, or the ethnic groups that they originated from in Africa, right? And so because of this, there's this rich history of African resistance on the island, dating back to enslavement. I want to talk about, very briefly, an African liberation fighter named Carlota. Carlota was one of the head conspirators of the Triunvirato plantation uprising, which is basically, she used her machete, she cut the chains to, where they were holding all the enslaved Africans. They flooded out, they burned the plantation down, and they went around the island burning down other plantations in what is referred to as La Escalera, or the stairs, because it was an escalating rebellion, right? Carlota, I bring her up, she's significant because when the Angolan liberation struggle is happening, Angola is struggling, South Africa is invading, right? Fidel sends 3,000 Cuban soldiers on special mission to go and support the liberation struggle. And he does this not only because he understands, again, that it's the politically correct thing to do, but also because he asks the African people on the island, what do y'all want to do? What y'all want to do? And they say, we want to go fight. We want to go support our sisters and our brothers on the island. So we're seeing these deep connections between Cubans in Africa and the continent that has allowed them to foster this desire for resistance and this consistent facilitation of resistance that I think is something that, as Africans here, we can look to. And we can see that this tradition is possible. We are in this tradition. And continued resistance against imperialism on a daily level, because folks there on a daily level are resisting the blockade by continuing to go about what they need to do, by finding resources in communities where there's difficulty with the trash system, because again, the Cuban government lacks resources. They don't necessarily have all the resources in the world to have consistent trash pickup. Local African communities have started using the bicycle taxis that they use around the city to pick up trash. So we're seeing autonomous action on a community basis. That's resistance. And so, sorry, I say all that to say, I realized I didn't finish the story about Carlota. But I bring that up to say that the 3,000 soldiers that were sent to Angola, that operation was called Operation Carlota, because Fidel wanted to make a direct connection between the history of African resistance on the island to the struggle that was happening on the continent, right? So this struggle has never been disconnected. And I think that, thinking about Assata in the context of that, this maroon woman who liberated herself, with the help of her comrades, and was able to be protected in this island that is so rich and deeply entrenched with African resistance against colonialism. I mean, I can't help but think that there's some kind of spiritual connotation there. And maybe that's just me being dramatic, but I really do think that there's something to be said about the willingness of the Cuban government to keep this sister protected, even when they could have gotten these genocidal sanctions released. And I think that level of steadfastness and discipline, I think that's something that anybody that is involved in the struggle can look to. But I think that it's also especially relevant that that steadfastness was being demonstrated in the context of keeping somebody protected. What would it look like if we protected our communities that steadfastly? What would it look like if we protected our political prisoners who get out that steadfastly, that closely, if we held them that tightly? So I say that all to say that I think, as Africans here, it's important that when we think about being in solidarity with, other Africans across the diaspora, we are seeing solidarity is not just important because it's the politically correct thing to do, but because this is literally an extension of our struggle. This is literally an extension of our experience. And we have a responsibility to one another. And I think that Assata's time in Cuba, and I would say that for those of you who haven't seen, there's a documentary called Eye of the Rainbow, right? And she's in Cuba there, and she talks a lot about her experience there. So knowing about the time that she had in Cuba, understanding the contributions that Cuba has made to African struggle globally, I mean, I think that it's just yet another example in the long list of examples that we have of our people of why it is so important to have an internationalist perspective, why it is so important to be as tapped in with what is happening in other parts of the world as we are with our communities right now. So that's what I was going to say. Thank you.